War has always been sold as sacrifice, of blood, of lives, of patriotism, but behind every declaration, every flag raised, and every battlefield funded, there's a quieter economy that never loses. It's the war dividend, a profit stream so consistent that it has outlived empires, rewritten laws, and turned 5 American dynasties into symbols of power itself. While soldiers bled on the front lines, these families built boardrooms, and while history called them patriots, their ledgers told a different story. From gunpowder to oil, from finance to logistics, they learned to turn conflict into capital and peace into preparation for the next boom. The DuPonts weaponized chemistry, the Rockefellers monopolized fuel, the Morgans financed both sides of war, Lockheed Martin's predecessors perfected the art of cost overruns, and Halliburton built an empire feeding the military machine itself. Together, they have extracted more than $485 billion from America's wars, documented, traceable, and publicly recorded, all while hiding behind the banner of national interest. For 2 centuries, their wealth has compounded not in spite of war, but because of it. And the pattern continues. Contracts surge as soon as conflicts begin, budgets expand in the name of defense, and profits climb higher than ever before. This isn't conspiracy, it's history written in balance sheets. Tonight, we trace that lineage. From the War of 1812 to Iraq and Afghanistan, this is how 5 dynasties turned American wars into a business model that still pays dividends today. Every empire begins with a spark, and for the DuPont family, that spark was literal. In 1800, a French chemist named Eleuthère Irénée DuPont fled the chaos of post-revolutionary France and arrived in America with a skill that would change the nation's economy: the science of gunpowder. 2 years later, he founded E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company on the banks of the Brandywine River in Delaware, a location chosen for its perfect mix of isolation and proximity. It was close enough to Philadelphia and Washington to supply the military, yet far enough away to let explosions go unnoticed. What began as a small mill became the blueprint for the American military-industrial complex. By the War of 1812, DuPont was supplying nearly all of the gunpowder used by U.S. troops. It was their first major government contract, and it would not be their last. Every new war became an opportunity to scale production and tighten control. During the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, DuPont provided artillery powder worth over $1 million, equivalent to $35 million today, cementing their reputation as the government's most reliable supplier. When the Civil War erupted, the scale of demand was unprecedented. 4 years of continuous fighting consumed more than 4 million pounds of DuPont gunpowder, generating contracts worth $10 million, or roughly $300 million in modern dollars. Their mills ran day and night, guarded by armed patrols, while workers, many of them children, packed volatile powder into barrels bound for the Union Army. The profits flowed faster than the river beside them. And yet, while the DuPonts publicly supported the Union, their loyalties were measured not in ideology, but in invoices. Some members of the family sympathized with the Confederacy, but business triumphed over belief. They sold to the side that paid, and when victory came, they rebranded themselves as patriotic heroes who had armed the nation. The complexity of their position was buried beneath the weight of profit. By World War I, DuPont no longer just supplied explosives, they dominated them. Before the US officially joined the war, they were already selling millions of pounds of gunpowder and TNT to Britain and France. When America entered the war in 1917, their expansion was explosive in every sense. New factories, new workers, and new fortunes. DuPont supplied 40% of all explosives used by the Allied forces, and its profits skyrocketed in 4 years, from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million in 1918, equivalent to over $1 billion today. That surge of war wealth transformed the company into a dynasty. The DuPonts reinvested their earnings into peacetime industries, chemicals, plastics, textiles, and synthetic fibers. They used their gunpowder profits to found an empire of innovation: nylon, Teflon, Kevlar, and countless other materials that reshaped modern life. But beneath every bright chemical patent lay a dark origin, a fortune born from conflict. When World War II arrived, DuPont once again supplied the US military with explosives and materials, including nylon for parachutes and the Hanford plutonium facility for the Manhattan Project. These were cost-plus contracts, meaning the company was reimbursed for every expense, plus a guaranteed profit margin. They could not lose. The risk belonged to the taxpayer, the reward to the family. Even as the wars shifted, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the pattern never broke. DuPont's direct weapons division eventually merged into other corporations, but the family wealth it generated lives on. Today, the DuPont Trust is estimated at $30 billion, 6 generations removed from the first mill on Brandywine Creek. They are no longer powder merchants, but their empire still stands on its explosive foundation, proof that the first great American fortune of war has never truly stopped earning interest. If the DuPonts made America's wars possible with gunpowder, the Rockefellers made them unstoppable with oil. Every modern army runs on fuel, and for more than a century, that fuel came from one man's monopoly. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil, a company that would grow so vast that it effectively owned America's energy supply. By 1880, Standard controlled over 90% of the nation's refining capacity. What had started as a business soon became an infrastructure of power. Whoever controlled oil would control war, and by extension, the world. The first test came with the Spanish-American War, 1898. The US Navy had just transitioned from coal-powered ships to oil, and Standard Oil's refineries were the only ones capable of meeting that demand at scale. It was a short war, but it taught Rockefellers something priceless. When conflict erupts, supply chains become weapons. The Navy's tanks and destroyers could move only as fast as Standard's oil flowed. That realization turned petroleum from a commodity into a strategic instrument. Control the fuel, and you control the fight. By the time World War I began, the world had changed, and so had Standard Oil. Though broken up by the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1911, the fragments remained Rockefellers. Companies like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron were independent in name only. They still answered to the same fortune. When the Allies needed fuel, they bought from Standard's American successors. But when Germany needed it, they bought from Standard's foreign subsidiaries, particularly through Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Oil of New Jersey's German partners. This wasn't treason, it was legal corporate separation, a financial firewall built to survive any war. While soldiers dug trenches, the Rockefellers quietly doubled their empire. The profits from selling to both sides made John D. Rockefeller the world's first billionaire, a title that wasn't just about wealth, it was about leverage. His oil had powered the armies that shaped the century. His fortune powered everything else: banks, railroads, foundations, universities, and political dynasties. He had discovered something even more valuable than oil itself, a business model where war guaranteed growth. During World War II, the pattern deepened. Standard Oil of New Jersey supplied the US military with aviation fuel, lubricants, and rubber substitutes. But investigators soon uncovered an unsettling truth. Standard had shared synthetic rubber patents with the German chemical giant IG Farben, even after hostilities began. A Senate inquiry led by Harry Truman accused Standard of undermining the war effort. Yet when prosecutors tried to act, they were overruled because the Army needed Standard's fuel. The result? No jail time, no broken contracts, only more profits. When the war ended, Standard's fragments simply reorganized and thrived. Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron became the oil giants that fueled the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and every American intervention that followed. Their global reach meant they profited from both the destruction of war and the reconstruction that followed. Each conflict created a new spike in demand for jet fuel, diesel, and lubricants. all commodities, the Rockefeller descendants still dominated. By the 1970s, the Rockefeller name had become so synonymous with oil and power that the family began selling off visible shares, shifting their fortune into real estate, banking, and philanthropy. But divestment didn't mean detachment. The dividends from a century of war-fueled energy profits had already been invested, multiplied, and institutionalized. Today, the Rockefeller fortune is estimated at $11 billion, a fraction of what it once was, but still built on foundations laid in wartime. From the Spanish-American War to Iraq, oil has been the bloodstream of battle, and the Rockefellers have always held the syringe. Every generation of conflict refilled their tanks, and every headline of heroism carried a hidden invoice written in crude. They didn't just fuel America's wars, they owned the fuel that made them possible. If DuPont built the weapons and Rockefeller fueled the engines, then J.P. Morgan made sure everyone could afford to fight. Wars cost money, mountains of it, and no family understood that better than the Morgans. In an era when governments were still scrambling for gold reserves and paper currency was fragile, J.P. Morgan & Company became the lifeline that kept America's armies marching. By the turn of the 20th century, Morgan's signature was the closest thing to a guarantee of national solvency, and when the shooting started, every bullet, bond, and battleship came with interest. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was Morgan's first real taste of what wartime finance could mean. The U.S. Treasury needed rapid funding to mobilize troops, and the Morgans stepped in, organizing loans and underwriting war bonds for enormous fees. But this was only a rehearsal. The true transformation came with World War I. When the war broke out in 1914, America was officially neutral, but neutrality doesn't pay the bills. Within months, J.P. Morgan & Company had become the exclusive purchasing agent and lender for Britain and France, arranging more than $2 billion in loans, the equivalent of over $50 billion today. That money didn't stay in Europe. It flowed right back across the Atlantic to buy American weapons, uniforms, food, and fuel, much of it from companies owned by other elite families, DuPont, Rockefeller, and Bethlehem Steel among them. It was the perfect circuit. The Allies borrowed from Morgan, spent the money in America, and Morgan collected interest from both ends. When the debts grew too large for the Allies to repay, America's neutrality began to collapse under the weight of its own balance sheets. As Senator George Norris warned in 1917, "We are about to put the dollar sign on the American flag." He was right. When President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war, he was also protecting Wall Street's investment portfolio. The day America entered the conflict, the Morgan loans were suddenly safe, backed by the full force of the U.S. military. When the war ended, the profit machine didn't stop. The Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations from Germany, which in turn owed money to Britain and France, who still owed billions to America. It was a global pyramid of debt, and the Morgans managed every layer. They structured the Dawes Plan, 1924, and Young Plan, 1929, refinancing Germany's obligations with new loans so that everyone could keep paying everyone else, at least on paper. Every transaction earned Morgan's banks another round of commissions. Even the Great Depression couldn't fully unwind the web they'd spun. World War II brought another windfall. Before America officially joined, Morgan-controlled banks helped finance British and Allied purchases through programs like Lend-Lease, earning massive underwriting fees. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Treasury flooded the market with war bonds. And who do you think handled the underwriting? Once again, J.P. Morgan & Co. They profited on the way in, and when the guns went silent, they profited again on the way out by financing post-war reconstruction through the Marshall Plan, which was funneled through Morgan-linked institutions in both New York and London. By the Cold War, the Morgans had merged and evolved into what became J.P. Morgan Chase, a bank so large it effectively became part of the state's financial nervous system. Whether it was Korea, Vietnam, or the War on Terror, Morgan institutions handled bond issuances, defense contractor credit, and foreign debt, all while collecting billions in fees. The family itself eventually withdrew from public life, but their system never retired. When soldiers went to battle, the Morgans lent the money. When governments rebuilt, the Morgans lent again. It didn't matter who won, as long as someone owed. Their empire was built on interest, the kind that compounds not just on money, but on war itself. For them, peace was only a pause between payments. When the Age of Flight began, a new kind of warfare and a new kind of fortune was born. No family understood how to weaponize the skies better than the founders of what would eventually become Lockheed Martin. In 1912, two brothers from California, Alan and Malcolm Lougheed, later spelled Lockheed, started an aircraft company built on fragile wood, canvas, and an unshakable belief that war would always need wings. Their first contracts were small, experimental aircraft for the US Army, but their timing was perfect. Within just a few years, World War I proved that whoever controlled the air would control the battlefield. Lockheed survived where others crashed because it wasn't just building planes, it was building relationships. After the war, as most aviation companies folded, Lockheed pivoted to civilian planes, but never let go of its military connections. When World War II broke out, the company was ready. It produced more than 10,000 P-38 Lightning fighters and nearly 3,000 Hudson bombers, feeding a war machine that devoured planes faster than factories could build them. Those contracts were worth hundreds of millions at the time, equivalent to billions today. And from that moment, Lockheed discovered its real engine: politics. The company began hiring retired generals, admirals, and Pentagon insiders, not as consultants, but as executives. They placed factories in strategically chosen congressional districts, ensuring that thousands of jobs and votes depended on the success of each new project. Cancel a plane, and you didn't just lose a weapon, you lost payrolls across half a dozen states. That political shield made Lockheed nearly untouchable. By the Cold War, Lockheed was no longer an aircraft builder. It was a cornerstone of what President Dwight D. Eisenhower famously warned against in 1961, the military-industrial complex. From the U-2 spy plane that prowled the skies over the Soviet Union, to the SR-71 Blackbird that redefined speed and altitude, to the C-130 Hercules transport that still flies today, Lockheed owned the future of aerial warfare. Each program shared the same secret: cost plus contracts. That phrase may sound dull, but it's the golden formula of defense profiteering. The government agrees to pay all costs plus a guaranteed profit margin. If costs increase, the profit increases too. Failure becomes profitable, and overruns become standard procedure. The C-5 Galaxy project in the 1960s was the perfect example. The contract began at $2.1 billion, ballooned to $5.3 billion, and still delivered late and over budget. But Lockheed didn't lose a cent. The Pentagon simply wrote bigger checks. The company became too big to fail decades before Wall Street borrowed the term. Every time a scandal threatened to end the gravy train, Lockheed simply reminded Congress how many jobs would vanish if funding dried up. Every senator had constituents inside the machine. In 1995, Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta, creating Lockheed Martin, the largest defense contractor in the world. The merger was less a business deal than a coronation, the unification of America's air power under one corporate crown. Today, Lockheed Martin generates around $65 billion annually, and roughly 90% of that comes directly from U.S. government contracts. Its crown jewel, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, was sold as a $233 billion program. It is now estimated to cost over $1.7 trillion across its lifetime, 7 times over budget, and yet still receives congressional approval year after year. Why? Because Lockheed built the F-35 supply chain across 45 states, guaranteeing that 90 senators have local jobs tied to its production. Voting against the jet would mean voting against their own voters. It's a masterpiece of political engineering, so deeply woven into America's economy that dismantling it would look like treason. The Lockheed family no longer controls the company, but the machine they built lives on, a self-feeding loop of war, jobs, and money that even the Pentagon can't escape. When wars begin, Lockheed's stock price jumps. When peace drags on, the company quietly funds think tanks and research groups that warn of new threats on the horizon. Because in the sky above every war, there's always one shadow that profits no matter who wins: the silhouette of Lockheed Martin. If Lockheed Martin perfected the art of building the weapons of war, Halliburton mastered the business of running the war itself. Founded in 1919 by Earl P. Halliburton, the company started as a modest oilfield service firm in Oklahoma, specializing in cementing wells. But Halliburton's founder understood something that would make his company indispensable for generations to come. Whether it's oil or war, infrastructure wins. Armies may fire the shots, but without roads, bases, ports, and fuel, they can't move an inch. By the time World War II erupted, Halliburton had evolved from drilling mud to military might, winning government contracts to build bases, repair airfields, and manage logistics across the globe. Their genius wasn't just engineering, it was timing. War creates chaos, and chaos bypasses bureaucracy. Whenever the US needed a job done fast, Halliburton was there to say, "We can do it, no bid required." During World War II and again in Korea and Vietnam, the company's construction arm, Brown and Root, became the government's go-to contractor. Their relationship with power wasn't accidental. The founders of Brown and Root were major financial backers of Lyndon B. Johnson's political career. When Johnson rose to the presidency, the company's fortunes exploded. In Vietnam, Brown and Root built highways, ports, and air bases worth billions in today's dollars. Investigations into corruption and waste surfaced repeatedly, but every probe ended the same way: more contracts, more profit. By the 1990s, Halliburton had fused political access with military logistics. When Dick Cheney left his post as Secretary of Defense in 1993, he became Halliburton's CEO 2 years later. He knew the system from the inside, and he knew how to navigate it. The 1991 Gulf War had shown just how dependent modern militaries were on private contractors. So Cheney transformed Halliburton into a one-stop shop for war. Construction, food, fuel, sanitation, transport, Halliburton did it all. When soldiers deployed overseas, they ate in Halliburton-built cafeterias, slept in Halliburton-built tents, and fought from Halliburton-supplied bases. Then came 9/11, and with it, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. The Pentagon needed immediate support for an unprecedented scale of operations. Instead of opening bids, it handed Halliburton's subsidiary Kellogg Brown and Root, KBR, a series of no-bid, cost-plus contracts worth more than $40 billion. That phrase again, cost-plus, meant Halliburton was reimbursed for every expense, plus a guaranteed profit margin. If costs ballooned, so did profits. And balloon they did. Auditors later discovered billions in overcharges, including meals billed but never served, fuel deliveries that never arrived, and construction projects that were half-built and abandoned. Yet, the money kept flowing. The Pentagon explained it away as inevitable inefficiency in a war zone, YOWS. Meanwhile, Halliburton's stock price tripled between 2003 and 2008, even as American casualties climbed. Dick Cheney, by then vice president, officially recused himself from Halliburton decisions, but he retained stock options worth millions. Under his watch, Halliburton's government revenue increased by over 400%, and the company's name became synonymous with the Iraq War's corporate underbelly. It wasn't just about building bases, it was about building dependency. The US military could no longer operate efficiently without its private partners. By the time the Iraq occupation peaked, Halliburton was running a parallel military infrastructure across the Middle East. They managed logistics convoys, water treatment, fuel supply, maintenance, and even waste disposal. For every dollar spent on combat, another was spent on keeping the system running, and Halliburton had a hand in all of it. Even after congressional hearings exposed billions in waste and abuse, the outcome was predictable. Halliburton paid modest fines, then moved its corporate headquarters to Dubai, beyond the reach of U.S. oversight, and continued doing business with the same agencies that once investigated it. Halliburton's story is the logical endpoint of America's war economy. They didn't just profit from conflict, they outsourced it. By turning war into a service industry, they made battlefields into business units and soldiers into customers. In a world where every explosion creates another reconstruction contract, peace is simply bad for business. Add up the contracts, the loans, the oil shipments, the logistics, and the cost-plus guarantees, and a single number emerges from 2 centuries of blood and budgets: $485 billion. That's the documented total of war profits earned by 5 American dynasties: the DuPonts, Rockefellers, Morgans, Lockheed Heirs, and Halliburtons. But even that figure is only the surface. When you include stock price surges, real estate purchased with wartime windfalls, and new industries born from those profits, the real total climbs past $1 trillion. It's not just money, it's momentum, a self-sustaining cycle that converts every global crisis into dividends. The blueprint is simple, but devastatingly effective. Step 1. Position before the war. Each dynasty built its empire during peacetime. DuPont with gunpowder, Rockefeller with oil, Morgan with capital, Lockheed with prototypes, Halliburton with infrastructure. When the next conflict arrived, they were already in place, already indispensable. Step 2. Win the first contract. In moments of national panic, the government skips competition. No-bid awards are justified as matters of security. Once you have the first deal, you become the proven supplier. Step 3. Switch to cost-plus contracts. Every overrun becomes profit. The incentive isn't efficiency, it's expansion. Step 4. Overrun the budget. Promise a $2 billion project. Deliver a $5 billion one. The Pentagon pays anyway because canceling would waste taxpayer money. Step 5. Hire the regulators. Retired generals, Pentagon officials, and congressional staffers cross the revolving door straight into executive suites. Step 6. Lobby for more war. Fund think tanks, sponsor op-eds, produce intelligence assessments, and fill news programs with analysts calling for intervention. And finally, Step 7. Diversify the winnings. When peace comes, invest the war profits into chemicals, real estate, energy, and universities. Anywhere the money can compound quietly until the next conflict arrives. This pattern isn't a theory. It's the architecture of the American military-industrial complex, and it's still running at full speed. In 2023, the U.S. military budget reached $816 billion, and the 5 largest defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, absorbed over $200 billion of it. That's a quarter of the entire defense budget flowing to 5 companies, many of which still trace their origins to those same dynasties. Lockheed's F-35 program alone, the most expensive weapons project in human history, has suppliers in 45 states, ensuring 90 senators have a political reason to keep the money flowing. That's not national defense, that's congressional insurance. The result is an ecosystem that rewards perpetual tension. When new wars break out, stock prices rise. When old wars end, contractors pivot to rebuilding. When there's no war at all, the threat of one becomes the next marketing campaign. Analysts warn of rival nations, lobbyists whisper about security gaps, and television experts, many still on corporate payrolls, predict disaster if funding is cut. It's a perfect circle. Fear creates spending, spending creates profit, and profit funds the next round of fear. Even investigations can't break it. DuPont was accused of price-fixing explosives during World War I. No charges. Standard Oil was caught sharing patents with Nazi Germany, fined but never dismantled. Morgan was probed for manipulating war loans, no arrests. Lockheed was exposed for bribing foreign officials, settled quietly. Halliburton was audited for billions in Iraq over charges, paid fines, moved offshore, and kept contracting. In every case, accountability cost less than 1/4's revenue. The fines became business expenses, and the machine kept running. The tragedy isn't just the money, it's what that money could have built. $485 billion could have provided free college for 2 decades, rebuilt every bridge and highway in America, or funded universal health care for 10 years. Instead, it built weapons that sit in warehouses, planes too flawed to fly, and fortunes too old to fail. These are not normal profits. They're public funds turned private, extracted under the banner of patriotism and delivered to boardrooms that never see the battlefield. This is how war became America's most reliable investment, an industry immune to loss, insulated from prosecution, and renewed by every generation's next conflict. The faces change, the flags change, but the ledger remains. 5 dynasties, 2 centuries, $485 billion. Soldiers fight, taxpayers pay, and the system survives. Because in the United States, war isn't just policy, it's business. And for those who know how to write the contracts, it's the most profitable business in history. War has many faces. On the battlefield, it looks like courage, chaos, and sacrifice. But in the boardrooms of America's most powerful families, it has always looked like opportunity. For over 2 centuries, 5 dynasties have learned the same lesson, that fear moves faster than reason, and budgets follow fear. When the drums of war sound, politicians talk about freedom, honor, and security. But in the background, contracts are signed, balance sheets expand, and another generation of fortunes begins to grow. This is the pattern that turned conflict into currency. The DuPonts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, Lockheed Martin, and Halliburton, names that became institutions, foundations, and endowments. Their wealth polished by time until no one remembers where it came from. They built universities, funded museums, and donated to charity. But behind every building with their name on it lies a trail of public money once meant for soldiers, schools, and the future. And the cycle still turns. The next war is already being planned, the next crisis already priced, the next essential contract already waiting for a signature. Because war, in America, no longer ends. It simply rebrands. If this story changed how you see the headlines, if you've started to wonder who profits when nations bleed, then you're beginning to see what they never wanted you to notice. War is not chaos, it's choreography. And for those at the top, it's the most consistent business model ever invented. Subscribe, stay curious, and remember, follow the money, and you'll always find the war.